Winston Churchill famously said, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing, after they've tried everything else." What are some good examples that prove or disprove this quote's accuracy?
In the specific context of WW II, the British warned the US upon entering the war to adopt the convoy system for shipping, but the US refused to, until they finally did because shipping losses to submarines became too high. The British also told the USA that bombers would need to have a fighter escort or would suffer horrendous losses on bombing missions, but the USA sent bombers in without escorts because they were convinced that they were sufficiently capable of defending themselves. The USA suffered horrendous losses on bombing missions until they started sending fighter escorts to protect them. From WW II itself. After Britain had spent quite some time learning through costly trial and error the methods of escorting merchant ships through U-boat-infested waters, the U.S. Naval Command, particularly one stubborn admiral whose name I can't recall, proceeded to ignore all their advice for weeks to months. Hundreds of tons of merchant shipping from the U.S. were sunk due to insufficient escorts and convoy formations.
Disprove. M1 Garand. It wasn't the best infantry rifle we could have picked, but it was good enough and we could mass produce it enough. We were fully equipped with a main battle rifle 10 years ahead of everyone else in WW2. Not a great example, but another great quote by Otto von Bismarck: "God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America."
TBF, it probably applied just as much to him as it did to Americans.
Just a couple of months ago, the wife of an American diplomat killed a 19-year-old biker in the UK and then ran for the hills. She has to answer for what she did.
Why does this sound like someone's homework assignment? Edit, would love to see one of those YouTube channels make a video about this thread with the robot voice, and the incredibly long answers.
I can think of example that proves it's slightly wrong. During Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971, you can read about why, but just wanted to include, it was not like a communist revolution and Bangladesh was seeking to be a secular democracy. The United States took the side of then West Pakistan, now Pakistan, despite it being a very repressive regime and the Pakistani army committing genocide and genocidal rape during the war. The United States government was fully aware of it. American diplomat Archer Blood informed the government to the extent of the genocide through what is now called the Blood Telegram. To this day, the government of Pakistan does not recognize this, and neither does the United States.
The Civil War. They tried every kind of compromise to avoid a war, and finally it was a war that settled it. The fact that they don't use the metric system.
We didn't side with Germany in World War I. Edit, let's all stop fighting over this. I have my own opinions and you have yours.
There is nothing more odd than teaching American history to non-American students. Tuesday, Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Wednesday, slavery.
I think this applies less to Americans, rather than the human race as a whole.
Someone got an essay due tonight?
America passed a constitutional amendment to ban the sale and production of alcohol. Then they passed an amendment to reverse it after they realized they fucked up.
The Voting Rights Act.
Churchill also asked a woman one time if she would sleep with him for $1 million. She said, "Of course I would." He then asked, "Would you sleep with me for $50? She replied, "Mr. Churchill, what kind of woman do you think I am?" He responded with, "That has already been established, now we're just trying to figure out a price."
Reminds me of this story, not sure if it's true or not, where this American soldier is returning from a war and can't find a seat. Eventually they find a seat being occupied by a woman's dog. He asks her to move the dog and she refuses multiple times, so he throws the dog out of the window. Then this British guy turns around and says, "You Americans get everything wrong. You use a fork with the wrong hand. You drive on the wrong side of the road, and now you've gone and thrown the wrong B*** out of the window."
Tariff China and call on American companies to not do business there. Say what you will about the trade war and effectiveness of tariffs, but let me pitch this. How much have you seen goods increase in price in the US over the past 2 years? Because inflation has remained at a historic low of about 2.4%. Meaning relative to pay, goods haven't really changed. Jobs have continued to grow, the stock market hasn't collapsed, etc. While in China the stock market has halved, exports are down significantly, jobs have moved out of the country, people have been forced to close their businesses due to lost sales, private debt forfeitures have increased steadily, etc. China is feeling this trade war whereas the vast majority of Americans aren't. I'd love to see other countries push back on them as well. The Suez Canal crisis. An independent Egypt noted that the Suez Canal was in Egypt and nationalized it, paying all of the shareholders of the Suez Canal Company the current price of their holdings on the Paris Stock Exchange. Then the UK, Israel, and France invaded Egypt and seized the canal. The United States demanded they withdraw, and threatened to sell all the U.S. Treasury's British bonds, and wreck their economy. The U.S. didn't blink, just condemned close allies for imperialistic behavior and threatened serious action to stop them, after which they withdrew. After this humiliation the British and French empires gradually fell apart, and two allies against communism were greatly weakened, but it was the right thing to do.
It's not meant to be accurate, it's meant to prove a point.
Probably yet another thing Churchill never said. The good old USA banned pretty much everybody from Asia and the Asian Pacific from attaining full citizenship for ages, with some of the big examples being the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Immigration Act of 1924. Then in the 1950s, the Soviets pointed out how hostile Americans were towards Asia, and suddenly the federal government had a completely different outlook regarding them. They only stopped being racist against Asians on an institutional level because it would help slow the spread of communism, not because racism is a bad thing.
Americans like me sometimes accidentally do the right thing, so ha.
The opioid overdose epidemic. Pharma companies and doctors pushed these opioid painkillers like there was no tomorrow, everyone got hooked. They said, "Oh no. This is wrong," and cut back dramatically on their prescribing practices. The right thing to do? I'm not sure. This fueled demand for more opioids and subsequently fentanyl analogs flooded the streets, usually disguised as in heroin. Since all these folks fell in love with their opioids they got what they could, and with the nuance of the battle many have lost their lives. People might blame the users, which I don't completely disagree with. However, if the demand was never increased by social acceptance of the pharmaceuticals, we would not be in this extreme of a position today.
Disproved Native American policy. Prove eventually saying fuck it and going to war to end slavery.
Florida man stories can prove and disprove this.
Consider subscribing.